Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about a really fascinating incident, the Windscale Fire of 1957.
Yeah, the Windscale Fire. It's one of those events that really captures those early anxieties around nuclear technology.
You hear Windscale Fire and you think, oh, a fire in a nuclear facility. But it's so much more than that, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a story about ambition and miscalculation, about the pressures of the Cold War and the challenges of this really new and powerful technology.
So let's set the stage a bit. It's the 1950s. The Second World War is over. But now you've got this whole other tension brewing the Cold War. And Britain is in this race to establish itself as a nuclear power.
Right, and they're feeling this immense pressure to catch up, particularly to the Soviet Union, who were rapidly developing their own nuclear capabilities.
And to complicate things even further, the U.S. had been sharing some nuclear knowledge, but then decided to kind of pull back on that.
Yeah, the U.S. kind of clamped down on information sharing, which left Britain in a tough spot. They had to figure out a lot of this on their own and quick.
So that's where Windscale comes in. These were two reactors built in Cumbria, in the northwest of England, specifically to produce plutonium, which is essential for nuclear weapons.
And this is where things get interesting. The Windscale piles, as they were called, had this really unique design. They were air-cooled, which was pretty different from the water-cooled reactors that the US and the Soviets were primarily using at the time.
And that air-cooled design, that's going to be a key factor in the whole incident, right?
Oh yeah. It's going to play a major role in how the fire starts and how difficult it becomes to control.
Now, even before the fire, there were some warning signs that something wasn't quite right. And one of the figures who really stands out here is a physicist named Terence Price.
Right, Terence Price. He was kind of ahead of his time. He was raising concerns about the fuel cartridges used in the reactor. He thought they could potentially fail during the loading process.
And he even went so far as to push for filters to be installed on the chimneys to catch any radioactive material that might be released.
Yeah, those filters, they actually became known as Cockcroft's Folly. They thought he was being overly cautious, but as we'll see, those filters ended up playing a really crucial role.
There were other incidents too, even before the main fire, where fuel cartridges actually burst, and this caused some radioactive contamination around the site.
Right. And unfortunately, a lot of those incidents were kept quiet. There was a culture of secrecy surrounding these early nuclear programs.
So we've got this race to build nuclear weapons, a unique reactor design with some potential weaknesses and a few warning signs that maybe things aren't as safe and secure as they should be. And then there's this thing called the Wigner effect.
Yeah, the Wigner effect. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi movie, but it's a very real phenomenon and a potentially dangerous one. And it was a major factor in the Windscale Fire.
So what exactly is the Wigner effect?
Well, to put it simply, when graphite is exposed to radiation over time, the atoms within it get knocked out of place. This creates what's called stored energy within the material.
And the problem is that this stored energy can be released suddenly, causing a rapid increase in temperature.
Exactly. And guess what? The Windscale piles used graphite as a moderator. So you've got this buildup of Wigner energy in the reactor core, and it's just waiting to be released.
So they're essentially sitting on a ticking time bomb.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And unlike the US and the USSR, who had more experience with graphite-moderated reactors, the British were relatively new to this. They hadn't fully grasped the dangers of the Wigner effect.
They did develop a process called annealing to try and manage that buildup of Wigner energy, but it was a tricky process, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to control.
It's like they were trying to tame a wild animal. The more they tried to control it, the more unpredictable it seemed to become.
And then on top of all that, they had another problem. They were under pressure to increase production, not just of plutonium, but also of tritium, which is another key ingredient for even more powerful thermonuclear weapons.
Right, the hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
And with the Cold War intensifying and potential test ban treaties on the horizon, there was this huge push to get as much tritium as possible, as quickly as possible.
So they started pushing the Windscale piles even harder, making modifications to the fuel loads to boost tritium production. Even though some of their own technical staff were raising red flags about the increased fire risk.
It's a classic case of short-term gains versus long-term consequences.
Right.
And unfortunately, in this case, those short-term pressures would have some pretty serious long-term consequences.
And those consequences, well, those are what we're going to be digging into next.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in how this whole thing unfolded, stay tuned.
Okay, so we've got this reactor running hot under pressure, and they're trying to manage this buildup of Wigner energy. But what actually happened?
Yeah, how does this routine procedure turn into a full-blown nuclear incident?
Well, like we talked about, they were using this process called annealing to release that stored energy. It involved carefully heating up the reactor.
Right. So they're essentially trying to control the release of this energy rather than letting it build up to a dangerous level.
Exactly. But during this one particular annealing attempt, things started to go wrong. The temperature readings they were getting from the reactor started becoming really confusing.
So the operators, the people monitoring the reactor, weren't getting a clear picture of what was happening inside.
Right, and unfortunately, they misinterpreted those readings. They thought the annealing process was going as planned, when in reality, the reactor was starting to overheat.
And eventually it caught fire.
Exactly. They didn't realize the severity of the situation until it was too late.
So now you have a fire burning inside a nuclear reactor. And I imagine that's not an easy thing to put out.
Oh, absolutely. It was a nightmare. The air-cooled design, which had seemed so innovative at the time now, made things incredibly difficult.
Because air is feeding the fire.
Exactly. The air flowing through the reactor was actually helping the fire spread. It was like trying to put out a fire with a bellows.
So what did they do? What were their options at that point?
Well, they tried several things. First, they tried using carbon dioxide to smother the flames.
Carbon dioxide, that's what's in fire extinguishers, right?
Yeah, but in this case, it wasn't effective. The fire was just too intense. It kept spreading through that graphite core.
So they had to think outside the box.
They did. They were running out of options, and the situation was becoming increasingly desperate. So ultimately, they made a very risky decision. They decided to use water.
Water. But I thought water and nuclear reactors, that's a recipe for disaster, isn't it?
You're right. There was a huge risk of a catastrophic explosion if water came into contact with that hot uranium fuel.
So it was a gamble.
Yeah.
A last-ditch effort to try and contain the fire.
Exactly. It was a desperate situation, and they felt they had no other choice.
And
It worked.
yeah, thankfully it worked. The water did manage to extinguish the fire, but it was a very close call.
It could have been much, much worse.
Absolutely. It was a terrifying ordeal, and it's important to remember that there were people who risked their lives to bring that fire under control.
You're talking about people like Tom Toohey, right? Yeah. Tom Toohey was the deputy general manager at Windscale. He was one of the people who bravely went into that highly dangerous environment to direct the water jets. They were real heroes.
Putting themselves on the line to try and prevent a catastrophe.
Absolutely. Their actions were incredibly brave, and they likely saved countless lives.
So they managed to put the fire out. But the danger wasn't over yet, was it? I mean, there was still the issue of the radioactive material that had been released.
Right. Even though they contained the fire, there had been a significant release of radioactive material into the environment.
And one of the main concerns was iodine-131.
Yes, iodine-131. It's a particularly dangerous radionuclide, especially for children.
Because it can accumulate in the thyroid gland and lead to thyroid cancer.
Exactly. And that was a major concern in the aftermath of Windscale.
So what steps did they take to try and protect the public from this iodine-131?
Well, one of the most immediate and significant actions they took was to ban milk consumption within a 200 square mile radius of the plant.
Why?
Because cows grazing on contaminated pasture would ingest iodine-131, and it would then end up in their milk. So milk was a major pathway for this radioactive material to enter the human food chain.
So by banning milk, they were essentially trying to break that chain
Yeah.
and prevent people, especially children, from consuming contaminated milk.
Exactly. It was a crucial step in protecting public health.
Even with these measures, there's still a lot of fear and uncertainty. And unfortunately, the British government's initial response to the incident didn't exactly help matters.
Yeah, the government's initial reaction was to try and downplay the severity of the fire.
They were trying to control the narrative.
Right. They censored information about the incident and its potential health impacts, and that lack of transparency really eroded public trust.
It also created this climate of suspicion and anxiety.
Exactly. People didn't know what to believe, and they felt like they weren't being told the whole truth.
Which is understandable. I mean, this was a major nuclear incident. It had the potential to cause widespread harm.
Absolutely. And that brings us to one of the most important and complex aspects of this whole story, the long-term health consequences of the Windscale fire.
Yeah.
The long-term health consequences. It's something that researchers are still trying to fully understand.
I mean, it's been decades since the fire happened.
Yeah.
So what do we know about how it affected people's health?
One of the most well-established links is between iodine-131 exposure and thyroid cancer, particularly in children.
Right, because iodine-131 tends to concentrate in the thyroid gland.
Exactly. And studies have shown an increased incidence of thyroid cancer in people who were exposed to iodine-131 from Windscale, especially those who were young at the time.
And there have been more recent studies looking at the release of other radioactive materials like polonium-210.
Yeah, polonium-210, that's another nasty one. It's highly radioactive, and it can cause damage damage to various organs.
So the understanding of the long-term health effects of Windscale, it's still evolving.
Absolutely. There's still a lot we don't know, and it's an area of ongoing research.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag. We've got some solid evidence about certain health effects, but there's still some unanswered questions.
Right, and it's important to acknowledge that complexity when we talk about Windscale and its legacy.
Now, after the fire was out, they had to deal with the aftermath, the clean up the investigation, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, it was a massive undertaking. The damaged reactor core was basically entombed, sealed up to contain the radioactive material.
So it's still there under the ground.
Yeah, essentially. And there were extensive salvage operations to try and decontaminate the site as much as possible.
And of course, there was the official inquiry, the Penny Report.
Right. The Penny Report was a really thorough investigation. It looked into the causes of the fire, the decisions that were made, and the lessons that could be learned.
And what did the report conclude?
Well, it found that there were a number of factors that contributed to the accident. There were errors in judgment, communication breakdowns, and a lack of clear safety protocols.
So it wasn't just one single thing that went wrong. It was a whole chain of events.
Exactly. And that's an important lesson in itself. These complex systems, they require clear communication, strong safety procedures, and a real culture of caution.
And what about the design of the Windscale piles themselves? Did the report say anything about that?
Yeah, the report definitely pointed to some inherent weaknesses in the air-cooled design.
Like we talked about earlier, that air-cooled design made it much harder to control the fire.
Right. The report highlighted the need for more inherently safe designs that incorporate multiple layers of safety and redundancy.
So Windscale was kind of a wake-up call for the nuclear industry.
Absolutely. It forced people to really rethink how they approached nuclear safety and to learn from the mistakes that were made.
And those lessons learned from Windscale, they've had a lasting impact, haven't they?
Oh, definitely. They influenced the development of nuclear safety standards and practices worldwide.
So it wasn't just a local event, it has global implications.
Right. The lessons from Windscale helped to shape the future of the entire nuclear industry.
Now, when we talk about nuclear accidents, people often think of Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island. How does Windscale compare to those events?
Well, Chernobyl, that was a completely different beast. It was a level 7 event on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the highest level. A massive release of radiation, widespread contamination, and a significant loss of life.
And 3 Mile Island.
That was a level 5 event. Still a serious accident, but the containment structure held preventing a large-scale release.
And Windscale.
Also a level 5. So a significant release of radiation, but the impact was more localized. And thankfully, there were no immediate fatalities.
So while it wasn't as catastrophic as Chernobyl, it was still a major event with lasting consequences.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that even these lower-level nuclear incidents, they can have a profound impact.
A reminder that we can never let our guard down when it comes to nuclear safety.
Absolutely. Complacency is not an option when you're dealing with this kind of technology.
Well, this has been a fascinating and sobering look at the Windscale fire. It's a story about the risks and rewards of nuclear technology, the importance of safety, and the need for transparency.
And it's a story that's still relevant today. It reminds us that we need to learn from the past to ensure a safer future.
Absolutely. So as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. What are your takeaways from the Windscale fire? Head down to the comments and let's continue this conversation.
And if you're interested in learning more about this, we'll include some links to resources in the description below.
And don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into all sorts of fascinating and thought-provoking topics. Thanks for joining us.